Hey everyone, it's Rachel. I'm here a little bit early, but those who are going to be joining me, uh, hi, I'm Rachel. For those that don't know, or this is the first time watching this, I am an emergency physician. I live in San Antonio, Texas, and I do these kind of weekly updates about what I'm seeing in the emergency room here in San Antonio with COVID specifically. And so I will answer some questions, kind of go over the latest, greatest data for you guys, and go from that. I see some people have finally joined us, so I'm going to start getting into this a little bit. Let's just start with numbers. I like to give you guys the numbers, and that way you have context, and then I can kind of get into some updates and everything. Here in San Antonio, we are just over 36,000 cases. That's a huge increase from when this thing first started. And this all kind of relatively happened over the last month. Our deaths are now in the mid 300s. And if you look at the data, our deaths are increasing right now. Our overall numbers, though, of people testing positive has decreased in the city. I think today we were somewhere in the 300s. If you look at the overall in the world, we're about 600 and some odd thousand deaths. In the US, I think is like just around 200,000. I could be off on that a little bit, but needless to say, numbers are not great. But here specifically in Texas, in San Antonio, our numbers are actually looking a little bit better, kind of in comparison to what they were. So I get daily data from my
Mhm.
hospital, and that daily data, or actually from the hospital systems around the city, tells me like how many people are hospitalized, how many people are on a ventilator, how many people are on ECMO. If you guys don't know what ECMO is, it's the heart lung bypass machine, and all of that data. I get that every day as a medical director. For those who don't know, I'm a medical director of my community hospital in ER. So I get all that data and I get to see what's trending. And there is some bright news in this stuff going on. I mean, we're still in a very critical time. It's still really bad here in Texas. However, in San Antonio, and I think in Austin as well, we are starting to see a plateau of hospitalizations. So our number of hospitalizations are either not increasing or even slightly decreasing for the last week. This is fabulous news. This is the biggest indicator I look at what's going on in the community. So that's really, really exciting. Now, the amount of people dying is going up. And I did have a question about this that someone asked me earlier, and I said I would address this in this live. Why is that happening and what's going on with the death counts? So, yes, we are now seeing an increase of deaths in comparison to the number of cases. And there is a very specific reason for that. That you see that. So deaths usually lag behind hospital admissions. Gosh, I can't talk today. Sorry, guys. So basically, what happens is you have people get sick, and about a week to 2 weeks later, people are sick enough to end up in the hospital. We say about day 10 to 15 is when you get sick enough to end up in the hospital. Once you're in the hospital, it usually takes about a week or two for them to get sick enough to end up in the ICU and on death's door. So usually 2 to 3 weeks after someone is hospitalized, that's when we start seeing deaths happen. Okay. So in the last week or two, we have seen an exorbitant number of deaths in our hospital. And was expected. This is what we've seen in the trends. And this is what we were worried about. So we are seeing that death number go up. On top of the fact, the death data is going to be delayed in transmitting to the general public. So I was starting to see these deaths last week and the week before. When I did my video last week, I was pretty upset because I was seeing an increase in deaths, but we weren't seeing the decrease in hospitalizations yet. I wasn't seeing the decrease in my patients coming in, which I am now starting to see, which is wonderful. So it felt a little overwhelming. So now what you guys are seeing is the data saying that deaths are going up because it takes a while for the hospital to report that data. That data doesn't get reported out until death certificates and everything else are signed. So that can be a week or two out from when it actually happened. Now, we're still seeing large number of folks dying. That is the bad news in this. It's still a lot. And it is mostly elderly, although I can tell you a number of patients in their 40s and 50s that have died that I've seen personally. Most of them have comorbidities like diabetes or high blood pressure or cardiac disease. it is straining and stretching certain parts of the hospital to the max. And I don't think that the general community understands this. From an ER perspective, I'm not super stressed or strained most days at work. There are bad days where I get really sick people in, but I'm starting to feel like our numbers aren't horrible and it is manageable. I spend about half my shift dealing with COVID patients, but there's just kind of a rhythm to that. But our ICUs are jam packed, and they're still jam packed. It's to the point that it has strained my ICU colleagues quite extensively. And in fact, some of my ER colleagues are moonlighting in the ICU. So we are having ER doctors now from my group moonlight and take care of ICU patients overnight because our intensivists are so strained. And to give you guys an example of what's so straining about it, there was one night in my hospital where one of my colleagues coded or pronounced 6 people dead. They did 6 codes. That's where you do CPR and you all of that stuff. In a normal night, I cross cover codes upstairs in the ICU in my hospital because we're not big enough to need an intensivist in-house at night. And maybe I'll get called max 2 codes, maybe, usually just 1. This guy that was cross covering with my group for the ICU, this ER doctor, coded 6 people. 6 people. And then made a couple more end of life or comfort measures. That's what we do when we don't want to do CPR or put a tube down their throat. That's huge. My hospital isn't that big. It's a medium-sized hospital. So to have that many deaths, all COVID, is a massive amount. I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot. 6 deaths don't sound like a lot, but usually we don't have 6 deaths in the ICU in a week. So 6 in a night is a lot. Okay, so that is kind of where we're at now. So it's good and it's bad. So yes, we're seeing more deaths, but the good news is hopefully, fingers crossed, with the decrease in hospitalizations that we're plateauing out, that means people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. That means people are wearing masks. That means people are socially distancing. That means things like closing the bars down was a good thing. And I hope it keeps up. I really, really do. I am so hopeful because I am tired of this pandemic like everybody else. I want this to get better sooner. I want our businesses to open up. I want to be able to see my family again. I know you guys probably do as well. So I want all of that. And so it's real important. So I can tell you, I have not been out much outside of work and home and since the pandemic started. I get all my groceries delivered at home. I get all my supplies delivered. I had been to the post office once to mail off some prizes that I owed some of my subscribers. And I went to the dermatologist to get some moles cut off recently. And then that was it for the longest time. I finally went out. I had to get a new cell phone because mine broke. And I was pleasantly surprised that everybody in the store was wearing a mask. Nobody was making a scene. Everybody was staying spaced out. And it felt very reassuring to me that some people were taking this seriously. And I really hope that that continues because it is helping in places like San Antonio and Austin. So let's go into some other stuff. And then if you guys have any questions, please feel free to drop them down below. But I was asked a question about reopening, specifically with the knowing all this stuff about schools and what they should do. So my thoughts are, my particular city, I'm in San Antonio, for those that don't know, the county put in a basically a mandate saying that the first few weeks of the school had to be online. I did not disagree with this, although as a working mother, this is very difficult. My nanny that watches her kids during the day is not very technologically inclined, and so that makes it very difficult. I thought it was the right decision. Our teachers are not prepared for this. They don't have the proper gear. We need to get our numbers down a bit more. I thought that was the right move. I do want my kids to go back to school in person. I think it's very important. Now, knowing what I know, what do I expect or need from our schools to open up? They need to mandate face masks or face shields as much as possible. They need to give teachers probably better protective gear. So if they can give teachers N95s, that would be ideal. But I think a teacher should probably wear a face shield and a mask. I think that's important. Teachers should be allowed to go to work in scrubs like we are, so that they have easily cleanable garments that they can change down and not bring whatever home. They need to have extensive policies so that if a teacher gets exposed who's going to cover it, how they're going to deal with the students going out. And that's a hard policy to decide. And each school is going to have to individually decide what works for them, because what would work at my daughter's private small school may not work for a big public school. And then obviously they need to allow parents, if need be, to switch to online easily. So they need to have some flexibility in that. I also think that around the holidays, Christmas and New Year's and Thanksgiving, they probably need to consider an extended break in that period and extending summer a little bit longer, because we know that that is a time when people go around family, and I fully expect another resurgence of this infection in that period of time. So we need to plan ahead for this, knowing. Some of the other things, obviously, they're going to have to do lots of disinfectants. I'm not so big on the temperature checking. I think it's fairly useless. Most of the patients I'm seeing do not have a fever when they present to us. That can be easily faked by patients. Just give them a little Tylenol and ibuprofen. So I'm not a big proponent of checking everybody's temperatures. But I do think sending home children and isolating them away as soon as they have symptoms is probably wise. The one thing I worry about is how to get kids back once they are possibly infected. And a lot of these states are asking patients to go get their children tested. And that can be difficult depending on, your testing capability in your city. So right now, testing capabilities are pretty difficult in my city. So I don't know if my child were exposed and had to have a negative test. I'd probably just keep them out for the period of time that they would need to be out. So that's my thoughts on schools. So let's kind of segue in now. I'm talking about the time of period be off, but I wanted to read this comment real quick because someone just asked me a question here. So it says, wearing masks are mandatory everywhere for a while except the 12-year-olds and younger. Why is that? Okay, so the reason is that we're not seeing children, actually it's less than 10 is what we're not seeing. They are not seeming to be super spreaders of the infection. They still get the infection, they can still end up in the hospital, but we're not seeing them get it with the same symptomology or spread it as quickly. And they think that has to do with ACE2 receptors. So if you guys don't know, this is going to get a little science geeky, but ACE2 is a receptor that we have in our lungs. We know that as we get older, that receptor in our lungs gets up-regulated and we have more of it. Those folks on certain blood pressure medications can also have it more. And so that is the receptor that SARS-2-CoV, or the COVID-19 virus, we call it SARS-CoV, binds onto. They have these little proteins on their outer envelope called spike proteins. They bind onto that protein, and that helps it invade into the lungs. So children, by their very basis, we theorize, have less of these. We know this. And so therefore, that's probably why they're less likely to get a very severe illness and to spread it less, because they're not getting as much of it. We do know, or we have seen patterns, that this virus is very dependent on the amount you get. And what I mean by that is someone who's exposed to high amounts of these viruses, this viral load, gets sicker quicker. So when this first started in China, Italy, places where people weren't expecting it, we saw a lot of young, healthy healthcare workers go out and get sick and end up in the ICU, ventilated, and died, even though they had no risk factors. And the reason is they were exposed via procedures and aerosolizing things and people coughing in their face to very high viral counts. And that overwhelmed their system and it allowed them to get really sick. So we know this. So that is some of the theory behind it is, okay, well, children don't get as much because they don't have the receptors for this virus to get in. It's all a theory. This is what we theorize. So that is why a lot of places are not making children wear masks. That being said, children can still pass it. We know this. So if a child can tolerate a mask and they're under 12 or 10 or whatever, they should wear it. My daughter wears a mask when we take her out, which is very few and far between. My 2.5-year-old son managed to keep a mask on. I mean, it was difficult, but we got him and we coached him and he kept a mask on, even though the likelihood of them spreading it is pretty low. And if you can't get a child to wear a mask, sometimes you can get them to wear those clear face shields, and children tolerate that better. So anything you can do is good. Okay, so I'm going to segue into, I was going to segue into something and I completely lost my track of my thought. All right, moving on. So there's not been a huge breakthrough in treatments, unfortunately, if you guys are wondering. So we still use remdesivir, we still use convalescent plasma. Please, 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 if you haven't, go donate blood, go donate convalescent plasma. You are, if you've had it, please go donate. Those treatments we know work. There is some new data on the vaccines coming out, and some of it is very good and some of it's kind of so what we have found, the initial data show that the immunity to the vaccines isn't lasting as long as we'd hope, which is not surprising. If anyone has a microbiology background, you know that coronaviruses are, or the common cold is usually, your typical coronavirus doesn't get long-term immunity. We know this. That's why you can get the common cold over and over and over and over again. That's why we've never been able to make a great vaccine for it. And so they're thinking that now we're going to have to do at least two vaccines for it, meaning you're going to have to get the vaccine and a booster. This is not surprising. There are lots of vaccines like this where you have to get multiple boosters to get your immune system ramped up. Now, they are starting human trials, and so far it's been somewhat promising, but there is definitely I was reading an article that was saying that there's a lot of side effects with the vaccine, none of them dangerous, but they're definitely going to make you have flu-like illnesses, that they're going to make you have fever, shakes, and chills, and things like that. This is just one specific vaccine that's being studied. There are several out there, several companies are competing. So this is just one particular one. And that's because that virus is on the back of another virus called adenovirus. That's another common cold virus. So that's, your body's responding to it really, really well. So yay, good and bad. I still think we're at least a good 6 months out before we even can consider getting a safe vaccine out to everyone, and even then it's a little questionable. So yeah, that's that. Okay, another question I had that I thought would be interesting to answer is about safe travel right now, especially for those folks that don't have a choice and have to fly. Airlines are not doing the best job of spacing people out on airplanes with a middle seat. And really what I can say is, if you're flying on an airplane, try to act like everybody's infected. I know this sounds really horrific and probably depressing, but if you come into that mindset like I do in the ER, where I just assume everybody has coronavirus and I protect myself, I think that will make it a little bit easier to travel. So if you wear an outfit, maybe with layers, you always get cold on a plane, that you can strip off so that you're not infecting other people. Meaning, so like when you go to see your loved one, you have like a zippy hoodie that you can pull off and just wash immediately. If you can wear a face shield or goggles, that would really be ideal. Probably goggles. And then obviously the best protective mask you have. If all you have is a really good 3-layer cloth mask, that's what you're going to wear. Personally, if I'm going to fly, I'm going to do at least a KN95, which is the Chinese version of an N95. Most people can get those easily. I personally would fly with an N95 because I have my own. Obviously, not a lot of people are going to get their hands on that, and they're kind of trying to save them for healthcare workers. But if you have to fly, the best one you have, okay? And then big thing is lots of hand sanitizer. So when I'm at work, I take a little bottle of Purell. I have it at my desk, and that way if I touch anything, I can wash my hands really quick. If you're flying, try not to eat or drink on the flight. Anytime you take your mask down, when you're out and around other people, that's going to expose you. So same thing with eating. That's why I'm not a big fan of eating in restaurants right now, unless they're outside. It's because you physically have to take your mask off and eat with it off. And so you have to trust that everybody else is appropriately wearing their mask and not spreading stuff. And that's kind of hard when you're in a restaurant with other people. So yeah, that's my thoughts. Oh, I remember the last thing I was going to kind of go over was testing and the capabilities of it. I was segueing into that and I forgot. So testing, we're still not great at testing. We're still having issues with testing. So since this is peaking everywhere right now, pretty much everywhere, unless you're like Alaska or Hawaii, in the US, it's peaking everywhere. And so reagents, or the chemicals they use to run the tests, are getting sparse again. Excuse me, the swabs are getting sparse again. So it's going to be a little difficult to get tested. Your average ER may or may not be able to run a quick outpatient test. So for example, I can test rapidly anybody that comes into my hospital who needs to be tested. That being said, when I send people home, I have very limited ability to test those folks. And in many cases, I have to just presumptively diagnose them as it. If I know that, okay, they have fever, they have cough, they have nausea, vomiting, and they're sibling that they live with has COVID, they have COVID. I don't have the ability to test for that. And so this is something you're going to find before you go somewhere. If you're not deathly ill, and you don't need to go to the ER because you think you're deathly ill and you just need to get COVID testing, please call the place ahead of time to see if they're available to schedule an appointment, because you obviously will want to schedule an appointment at like an urgent care or a doctor's office, and to find the turnaround time, because if the turnaround time is 10 days, that's not going to be useful. What we are finding is that it can take anywhere from 2 days to 10 days for these send out tests. So just keep that in mind if you're having to get tested for work, and a lot of places are requiring it, and it is becoming difficult to get testing. And that's really hard. Like even for myself, getting tested is a little bit difficult, and I work in the ER. Um, other note, so CDC has changed some of the recommendation on, okay, I'm positive, now what do I do? And this is something that I think is important because a lot of us are having to go back into society to work and other things. And so there's kind of a mixed message about how long you need to stay away from people and everything. So I'm just going to kind of drill that down for those that are interested. So basically, if you are asymptomatic, meaning you don't have any symptoms and you randomly get tested positive for COVID, then you need to be 10 days from your test with no symptoms. That means 10 days, you're out, no symptoms. Now, if you have symptoms, you have to be fever-free for at least 24 hours, and you really need to be 10 days out from when your symptoms started, and your symptoms have to substantially decrease. Now, this is not perfect, and I can tell you we're seeing a kind of a double bump in cases, and this is something I'm seeing a lot in the last week, and it's kind of concerning to me, and I think this may be driving some issues here. I've seen at least 2 cases where people were diagnosed either end of June or early July with COVID, got fairly sick, and they were cleared either by multiple negative tests or their symptoms improved and their fever went away, and they were cleared to go back to a nursing home, or they were cleared to go back to work, and then they pop up with a fever and symptoms again, and their COVID pops up positive. I do not think these are reinfections. I truly think that these are cases where their viral counts dropped so low they were undetectable, and then they reared back up. We're seeing this over and over again. The CDC also recommends that if you've had symptoms that are very severe, and it's hard to say are very severe and mild, kind of, because each person has a different definition of that. But if you have severe symptoms, like you're pretty sick from it, you need to stay 20 days out from the initial symptoms. And I agree with that because I am seeing a double bump around day 20. So keep that in mind. The other thing we're seeing that's really disheartening about this disease, and I'm almost wondering if we're going to get like a monotype picture with this disease, is we're seeing long-term chronic sequela of this disease. So people are feeling weak for weeks to months. People are having chronic lung issues, like they go home and they can't walk around without their heart rate shooting up, or they need oxygen for weeks on end. I mean, these are young, healthy people that are having this problem. I personally know of a nurse who worked in ICU in Houston who was in the hospital for like a week, and he's still on oxygen, sent home. I mean, we're seeing this over and over and over again. People can't tolerate exercise. People are having chronic joint pains. And, it makes me wonder, is this going to be like mono, where people can be severely ill or weak or fatigued for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks on end? And so that is a little concerning. And then final thing, and then I'll call it a day unless anyone else has any other questions. But some of the symptoms, most of the symptoms are the same, but there is interesting. I saw a new classification of how they do the symptoms down, and what we're seeing is the folks that seem to have the most severe illnesses are both short of breath, febrile, and have nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. And I can agree with that. Most people that I see that are sick enough to be hospitalized are having all the symptoms. One of the biggest symptoms that I think people discount the most, that you should be most aware of, especially in the elderly, is fatigue. Severe fatigue. If I have an old person coming in and their complaint is either I'm confused or I'm super fatigued, it used to be a urinary tract infection that answered all of that. 9 times out of 10 now, it's COVID. So if you have an elderly grandparent that it lives, at home or even in a nursing home, and they call you because they're very tired and they're lethargic and they're not eating, they might have COVID. And that is something to keep aware of. And not to scare people, but I am just seeing a lot of it. And those elderly folks do the worst. So my hospital has a lot of nursing homes around it. And we're seeing a lot of that. Like I'm seeing much more of the elderly get this disease than the young. So that for me is very distressing. And it's awful. Please, 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 if you have an elderly family member, have that discussion with everybody about what happens if they get COVID. I know this is a horrible thing to have to do, but have that discussion early so that if something were to happen, you guys know how to plan, because you're not going to be able to go into the hospital. You're not going to be able to have these conversations in person with the doctor. You're going to have to be able to make these decisions over the phone and relatively quickly. And I don't want anyone to kind of be in a state not of knowing what to do. And I have had these lengthy discussions with my own family, with my grandparents. I have a grandmother who's in the nursing home. I have another elderly grandmother that lives at home. I've had these discussions with my family members about what we would do if they were to get COVID. Okay. And I think that's important that all of you guys have those discussions. All right, guys, that is it. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I answered all the questions that people had. We'll see how this week goes, and I'll let you guys know in the community tab of kind of when I next will post up. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that my next live update will be good news again, because it's much nicer to come to you guys with good news than bad news and me crying on the camera and feeling extremely defeated, which is how I felt last week. It's good to finally have some good news in this. And so I hope, fingers crossed, that that's the direction we continue going in. All right, guys, I will talk to you later, and thank you so much for watching.